Hi, my name is Joshua Underwood, and today I'm going to be talking to you about the early church as well as the architecture and worship space amongst early Christianity. So, I want to first introduce you to material culture, which is the physical objects or spaces through which a religion can express its beliefs. Christians believe that since God entered the material world in the form of Jesus, matter can be sacred and be used to help bring believers closer to God. You see this with certain artifacts, certain religious standards that the church has held, even still to this day, with things like communion or what is better known as the Eucharist. You also see this with baptism, and so I think it's interesting that it's kind of still upheld today. So let's keep going here. So the first thing I want to talk to you about is the historical development of Christian workspaces. So before Constantine actually made Christianity legal, they had to kind of do it in private. As you know, they were facing Roman persecution. After all, it was the Romans who did crucify Jesus. And so what they would do was they would meet in these homes, these little small houses called house churches during the 1st and 3rd centuries. They mainly focused on two of the 7 sacraments, if you will. One being the Eucharist, which is the body and blood of Christ, better known as communion if you grew up in sort of a church in Georgia, and then baptism, so life through water. Those are the main two that they focused on back then. So they had gatherings. They would do everything that we kind of do today: scripture reading, singing, worshiping, prayer. All that stuff as well still goes on today. And the early worship was informal and community-driven. It was, led by appointed overseers, bishops, and deacons rather than a formal clergy. So the next thing that we'll talk about is relics and sacred places. So you see on the right, that first one being the Shroud of Turin. It's one of the most studied artifacts in the world. It has turned atheists into Christians time and time again. So after Constantine did essentially legalize Christianity, pilgrims to holy sites in Jerusalem and Rome became common. And so they could actually worship in public. They didn't have to do it in these cave systems that we'll talk about in a little bit later. So they had relics, they had the crown of thorns, the veil, all that stuff that you can still see today that has been kind of carried over or really brought down throughout Christianity. And so these relics were thought to carry divine power, to attract the faithful, to really make it seem like these Christians were, being rewarded or being fruitful, if you will. So they also had churches and shrines that were built over the tombs of martyrs, apostles, making the site itself sacred and holy. You'll see that, especially when you have like the apostles, like Paul, for example. And then relic veneration reinforced the connection between the living church and the communion of saints. So next, we'll talk about catacombs to churches. So in Cappadocia, Turkey, it's one of the early church sightings that you can actually still visit to this day. And fun fact, it's a cave system. It served as a refuge for early Christians before the legalism of Christianity. They carved it into the mountain, and Wes Huff has a really great YouTube video about it, where he actually goes in there, and it goes down and down and down and down, and it's a full-on city. So he gave churches a chance to, worship God back then whenever they were being persecuted. So unlike the Roman catacombs, which were primarily burial sites, Cappadocia's cave systems were living communities for shelter storage and just, common religious practices. It gave early Christians a chance to worship God. And the region later became a major center of early Christian theology, home to the Cappadocian Fathers, who played a role in defining Trinitarian doctrine at Constantinople.
So now I'm going to talk about what Christians have done to make church feel closer to heaven. So Christians believe that churches are more than a place to come together and worship God, but that they are actually sacred spaces where Christians can encounter God. Our textbook states the church was conceived as the house of God and the place where heaven and earth came together. So Christians believe that in church, Jesus is there with them. According to Matthew 18:20, for where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there I am among them. So not only is it a gathering place where 2 or 3, but typically more people can gather and worship him, but a place where he will physically be present. So according to our textbook, churches are considered sacred when they follow 2 factors. So the first factor is that Christ became physically present during the Eucharist, which is also known as the Last Supper or Communion. As you can see to the right, the famous The Last Supper by Da Vinci is a representation of this moment, and churches are places to celebrate that and also recreate it. A lot of churches do communion and celebrate that moment. The other factor is that churches house relics that brought worshipers to feel closer to saints and martyrs. So the anatomy of a church, a lot of the church is built very intentionally and represents a lot of different things. So the first part of a church is the nave, this is the main gathering space, and it represents coming together as a group to worship God. The next section is called the sanctuary, which is the sacred area surrounding the altar, and this is reserved for members of the clergy. And then the altar is the holiest place in the church. Our textbook states that it is the place where Christ was made present. It symbolizes the sacrifice that Jesus made, and a lot of worshipers will go to the altar to feel closer to God. On the right, this is an example of a medieval cathedral, and if you look closely, the floor plan is actually set out to be shaped like a cross, which is pretty cool. So this is an example of an altar of a Catholic church. It's decorated very beautifully, very intricately to show the holiness of the altar and just show the beauty represented and God physically becoming present. There's also a lot of symbolism in church architecture, a lot more subtle symbolism than stuff like the floor plan being shaped exactly like a cross. There's a lot of different ways that Christians symbolize different things. So according to our textbook, many churches have the sanctuary facing east, which represents not only Jesus' resurrection, but that he will come back down to earth. Some churches are built to form a cross, as we saw in the last one, but I found the most interesting representation to be through numbers. So this could be physical numbers, shapes, or as you see on the right, this church has 7 steps, which represents perfection. So 1 represents unity, the Holy Trinity is represented by 3, resurrection is represented by 8, and completeness is represented by 12. So the number of sides for the shapes can mean certain things, but numbers are more specifically symbolic when they're mentioned in the Bible multiple times. For example, 7 is represented as the God made the heavens and the earth in 6 days, and then on the 7th day he rested. That is why the Sabbath is on the 7th day. It was also when Joshua's army marched the walls of Jericho for 7 days. 7 is just represented a lot in the Bible, so it is claimed as the number for perfection. In Psalm 12:6, you see, "And the words of the Lord are flawless, like silver purified in a crucible, like gold refined 7 times." So that is where we see that 7 is flawless and represents perfection.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ethan Hughes, and today I am going to be discussing the development of Christian architecture throughout the years. I'm going to expand a little bit about what my buddies Josh and Hayden had to say earlier. So let's get started. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is the construction of the Hagia Sophia in the heavenly space. So even after the fall of the Western Roman Empire shakes up Europe, the construction of churches remained an important task for all Christians. Constantinople being a very powerful city, and a center of a lot of congregation, a lot of inhabitants live there, a lot of resources, a lot of wealth flowing in and out of that city. They are in charge of constructing the large churches. In the 300s, Emperor Constantine, he constructs the Church of the Apostles, um, in which he himself wanted to be buried next to famous biblical apostles. And at the time, it was the largest church in all of Christianity. However, later in the 6th century, Emperor Justinian has the Hagia Sophia constructed, uh, and it had dwarfed all churches prior to itself in size and splendor and grandeur and beauty. Um, and there's a large dome that encapsulates the building, and its creation embodied the cosmic truth of the Christian faith. The dome itself, to many Christians, looked as if it had descended from heaven itself. There's a lot of natural lighting that flowed in, and it was very awe-inspiring for many Christians that went there to worship. A little less than 1,000 years later, the Muslim Turks capture the church, make a few little innovations to the exterior of the church, and convert it into a mosque. As we see over here to the right, it is currently serving as a museum. Moving on, I'm going to discuss the two main styles of architecture throughout this time period. The first being Romanesque, which originates somewhere around the 10th century. It features rounded arches, small windows. It's in a cruciform shape, meaning that the building itself is in the shape of a cross. It had thick walls as well, as we can see over here. This abbey in Normandy, France, is a good example. And it also featured a dark and solemn atmosphere. A lot of worshipers would go to pray and reflect, oftentimes in silence, and this kind of set. Moving on to Gothic architecture, this became popularized in the 12th century roughly, and by the 15th century, it had taken over Europe entirely. Um, Gothic architecture was suited for larger churches, such as cathedrals. One of the most famous examples being the Notre Dame of Paris, France, that we see in the bottom right there. This also featured a cruciform shape, meaning the building, again, is in a cross shape, featured large windows, pointed arches. We see the emergence of stained glass becoming popularized during this time, and we get this technological innovation of the flying buttresses, which allow for more load bearing to different parts of these large buildings instead of the walls, so the walls don't have to be as thick. Oftentimes, when we think about these ancient structures, we think about very large stone buildings that were huge places designed to be permanent and stand the test of time. Whereas today, you could drive 10 miles down the road on your way to work and you'll probably pass a handful of churches. So let's look at some differences in between some of these buildings. So back then, Catholic cathedrals, they featured massive gatherings, a distant altar, and an elongated nave. And they were oftentimes fortress-like. Whereas today, the ceremonies are typically more intimate. The altar is very close and welcoming as to offer a place for anyone in the congregation to come up to the front and worship. And it also features a lot of modern day architecture, as we see up to the right here. Orthodox churches, they used to separate gender. The lighting was often dim, and there were large chambers for acoustics to echo throughout. Whereas today, families sit together, they utilize a lot more natural lighting, and the spaces are oftentimes a lot smaller now. Um, Finally, Protestant churches, they used to be very elaborate. There was a high altar in which everyone in the congregation would look up at the priest up front, and they were cruciform in shape. Whereas today, as we can see in this bottom right, let me move my face over here, is very minimalistic. There's a stage in the center, and there was features stadium seating. Um, so yeah, it looks a little bit different today. Yeah, and these are the three major categories we wanted to discuss to you guys today. And here are all of our sources. And we want to thank you so much for your time and attention, and thank you for listening.